You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
N2K has teamed up with AWS to bring you AWS in Orbit, a groundbreaking new series that explores the impact of space technology, cloud computing, and generative AI. Hi, I'm Maria Varmazes, and in this series, I speak with industry leaders to give you a nuanced understanding of how these technologies are revolutionizing sectors like sustainability, critical infrastructure, and cybersecurity. So if you're drawn to big ideas and are curious how space and cloud technologies are impacting life here on Earth, this series is for you. Follow the T- Space Daily podcast to catch every episode of AWS in Orbit and visit space.n2k.com/AWS to stay ahead of the curve.
This episode of the Cyberwire is supported by Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat discussing tech topics big, small, and strange. Compiler comes to you from the makers of Command Line Heroes and is hosted by Angela Andrews and Brent Simoneau. You know, one of the things I love about Compiler is the way they address issues that we're all thinking about. In a recent episode called The Great Stack Debate, they debate whether a software stack is like an onion, a sheet cake, or lasagna. That's the kind of metaphor I can get behind. If you're like me, you don't have a lot of time, and so you want to have a show that is concise and respects your time, and Compiler does just that. I hope you will check it out. Listen to Compiler in your favorite podcast player. We'll also include a link in the show notes. My thanks to Compiler for their support. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cyberwire's Research Saturday. I'm Dave Bittner, and this is our weekly conversation with researchers and analysts tracking down the threats and vulnerabilities, solving some of the hard problems, and protecting ourselves in a rapidly evolving cyberspace. Thanks for joining us.
We were hunting around mostly for compromises of Windows library files. That's when we stumbled upon a Trojanized ULAP DLL file. So I would say in a nutshell, this is kind of a logging library that is loaded by a few Windows services when started.
Our guests today are Aleksandar Milenkoski and Juan Andres Guerrero-Sade from SentinelOne's SentinelLabs. They're sharing their work, Sandman APT, a mystery group targeting telcos with a LuaJIT Toolkit.
So we noticed this and then examined the file in more detail and saw the implementation of a rather intricate, rather complex staging mechanism.
That's Aleksandar Milenkoski.
That delivers the backdoor, which we then named LuaDream. And this was what kicked off our deeper investigation in this threat activity overall, I would say.
Juan, anything to add to that?
Well, I have to say, after Metador and Tainted Love and some of the other stuff that we've worked on recently, we have been paying a lot more attention to the telco space. As far as we can see, it looks like there's possibly 4 to 5 different advanced but not very well attributed threat actors that seem to be operating primarily in telcos around the world. And it's something that's really caught our attention, and we've been trying to get our, wrap our heads around and keep some sort of situational awareness over.
Well, let's dig in here. Why don't we start off with a description of Sandman themselves? What do we know about this organization?
Right. When looking at this threat cluster overall, I would say that the use of the backdoor, the LuaDream, which is a modular Lua-based backdoor, is what is really unique about the Sandman activity from our perspective, at least. The thing is that Lua-based modular backdoors like LuaDream have been observed, I would say, relatively rarely in the threat landscape. And when observed, they were rather in the context of advanced APTs, which were historically considered Western or Western aligned. There is a rather interesting historical context on the use of Lua, which Juan has been researching in greater detail.
Juan, you want to fill us in there?
Sure. So basically, the subtext here that I think is never sort of plainly stated is that the combination of C++ and Lua for malware toolkits has always been considered a bit of a telltale sign of Western operations. Western sort of broadly defined. But if you think about it, right, the history of it is Flame 2, Project Sauron, Evil Bunny from Animal Farm. These are all operations that have generally been sort of considered Western aligned, whether it's U.S., Israel, France, etc. So a lot of folks will look at, folks in the know will look at a new piece of malware that's C++ and Lua and immediately sort of assume that this is a case of blue on blue or some kind of, the kind of operations that you might not be particularly against, right? That is something that we've been profiling a great deal and sort of working on, to like understand sort of that history of development, but B, because we're starting to get the sense that that is no longer the case. We understand sort of the importance of that paradigm, why it's been useful. It is actually fascinating as far as the development of the malware itself goes. But I think more importantly, we're starting to see those techniques trickle down to other threat actors that are obviously not Western aligned. Something to do with Sandman is they're attacking telcos in Western Europe. So we're beyond that point where we can just say, look, this is only something that our boys do or that friendly govs do, if you consider such a thing. But rather that we need to kind of open our aperture and accept that sort of the cat's out of the bag and we're seeing different teams use this quite nefariously.
I can't help wondering, do you suppose this is a case of imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, or could it go so far as to be intentional misdirection?
I think there's a variety of things to consider there, right? There's imitation as a form of flattery, right? This stuff is not quite so private anymore since the threat intel space got their hands on it as early as 2012. It's been getting reported. There's also a technical end to it, right? I think folks who've never done C++ development or Lua don't understand why Lua is more important or more useful than any other scripting language, let's say Python, but rather, if you pay attention to Lua, it is actually very, very special. It's a virtual machine. It's running on a virtual machine that's written in C that can be compiled in a very small form factor directly into a C++ code base. And when you look at how complex some of these pieces of C++ code are, and you consider that you would, in theory, have to recompile this whole thing if there's ever an error, if you ever want to inject new functionality, etc. Lua actually becomes this really valuable bridge where you can basically toss scripts into this running VM inside of an existing code base, and you can fix your malware on the fly without having to replace it, without having to recompile it. I think that's where a lot of sort of the emphasis and the magic and the preference for it has come from. When you look at the new operations, though, the question is, are they imitating it? Are we looking at a Project Raven style case where the folks who knew from over here have decided to go somewhere else? Or have, just other C++ development gurus decided that this is also a good way to go about solving their problems?
Well, let's dig into some of the details here. How does Sandman go about doing the things that they do? You mentioned that they seem to be targeting telcos.
Yeah, sure. So just to circle back on Sandman and that particular cluster. So I mentioned already the use of Lua as something that distinguishes this cluster from other activities that we've been observing recently. Other than that, in addition to deploying LuaDream, the threat actors used, I would say, primarily open source living of the land tooling to steal credentials, move laterally within the victim networks, and so on. Regarding victimology, we observed that threat actor targeting primarily telcos in the Middle East, Western Europe, as JAGS mentioned, and South Asia. We, but also some industry partners, have also observed Sandman's presence in government entities. This was mostly in South Asia. So to summarize in a nutshell, I would say telcos and government entities seem to be among, at this point at least, the top coveted targets by this threat actor. We're still working on some reliable attribution indicators on this threat actor, so stay tuned on that front. So it's a small teaser from our side. That being said, the locations and sector of the victims may relate to the geopolitical interest of whatever nation state is backing or even hiring the Sandman TA.
And what specifically does it seem as though they're after here?
Right. I mean, the Sandman clearly has cyber espionage motivations, right? The victimology, the TTPs that we observe, the use malware, of course, LuaDream are very indicative of this. For example, in one instance, we observed that threat actors have been present in some environments for months, and then suddenly were strategically moving to workstation of managerial personnel, right? And in general, coming back to the victimology and telcos in particular, I would say that they're in general a very attractive target to cyber espionage TS. Overall, so they provide them access to things like data, of course, like telcos host a lot of customer and employee private or communication data as well. Data on proprietary communication technologies, of course, infrastructure. So they have large infrastructures, right, often syndicated. And intrusion in telcos can also be used for downstream compromise in some cases to associated organizations.
And now, a word from our sponsor, SpyCloud, the cybercrime analytics leader. SpyCloud disrupts cybercrime by telling you what criminals know about your business and your customers, so you can take action to prevent ransomware, session hijacking, account takeover, and online fraud. SpyCloud constantly recaptures and analyzes new data from the criminal underground, including credentials, session cookies, and PII siphoned from malware-infected devices. With knowledge of the specific exposed data criminals have in hand from InfoStealer malware on managed and unmanaged devices, security teams can respond with a more efficient and effective process called post-infection remediation that fits seamlessly into existing incident response frameworks. Get SpyCloud's post-infection remediation guide outlining the 7 steps for preventing a malware infection from becoming a full-blown ransomware incident. Visit spycloud.com/cyberwire. That's spycloud.com/cyberwire. And we thank SpyCloud for sponsoring our show. What are you all seeing in terms of their own infrastructure here? You know, things like command and control.
Right. So actually, this aspect was one of the more interesting things in our research, I would say. So I will just start from high level. Rather, like at this point, we don't really place Sandman among the most sophisticated APT groups out there. So this is mostly because of the lack of clear C2 infrastructure segmentation that we observed. So I would say this is something that you just don't see among the absolute pros in the game. JAGS, of course, can add to that. But that being said, we observed discrepancy between the sophistication of Sandman from an operational perspective, especially regarding its C2 infrastructure and LuaDream or the malware itself. So this led us to think about potential involvement of a third-party vendor that is supplying these operational groups or multiple operational groups with malware. So this is an interesting topic that we certainly plan to explore in greater detail in the future.
JAGS, do you have any insights on that part of it?
Well, it's sort of it's an interestingly opaque sort of space, right? We see these different variations when it comes to infrastructure. We see also the way that they move inside of the network. I'll say that, we've been harboring some suspicions about what actors this may relate to. Part of the problem with sort of figuring out entirely new or seemingly new clusters of activity is that, just the same as the attackers have developed, you have to come to this moment of questioning, like, is this somebody we've seen before and we just don't recognize their new toolkit? Or are we dealing with an entirely new cluster of activity that we just had not caught on to before? And I think in many ways with something like Sandman, it's still a bit of an open question. I think it's very difficult to diagnose or to just sort of figure out from afar if you're dealing with a mercenary group, which is sort of the more complicated end of this, because you can't rely on the usual heuristics of, well, who do they attack? Where do they seem to come from? What is their language? What is their time zone? Okay, well, that should give us enough to surmise who we may be dealing with. When it comes to somebody that's sort of potentially a commercial provider for a variety of groups, you don't get to have those sorts of simple heuristics. So it's a very complex situation where we look at this, we look at Backdoor, which we worked on last year. You look at publications like things like Light Basin that other folks have been looking into. And there's this broad question of just how many folks are operating in the dedicated telco space. How much awareness do they have about how these places are set up, and how well are they doing that they seem to be gaining quite a persistent foothold in a lot of places.
And how exactly are they getting in? What is the initial access here?
Well, we're still analyzing available telemetry data, basically trying to determine the concrete initial intrusion vector. In general, I would say that although we lack concrete indicators at this time, the current suspects are the usual. So we are talking about vulnerability exploitation, maybe social engineering phishing attacks, maybe even purchasing access from initial access brokers. That's something that we relatively often see as well.
Part of the difficulty in the situation, the reason that I mentioned that there's a certain amount of sort of familiarity with their victim environment is in the case of Sandman in particular, we were seeing them what appeared to be moving laterally across one of the victim networks in such a way as to avoid machines that the SentinelOne agent had been deployed to. So you can see sort of where they're trying to abuse a certain amount of like this sort of blind spot that comes with things that we can't help, right? If a certain enterprise is only deployed to 60% of their endpoints or 80% of their endpoints, then you do have sort of this dark matter that comes with that other side of the house that's sort of unprotected, uninspected. And when they accidentally tripped onto a machine that had our product on it, that's when Alex latches onto it and we start to figure out, oh, they've actually been hopping around the network very, very carefully trying to avoid us. So there's definitely a certain, there's a reason that this is such a, complex endeavor, interesting endeavor. And it does go hand in hand with the fact that you're dealing with sort of a sentient enemy that is adapting to what you do just as much as we're adapting to them.
I mean, does that imply that there's a certain amount of scouting that they're doing ahead of time?
Absolutely. There's a great deal of scouting.
What we also observed, at least on those endpoints where we had telemetry on about the activities, we definitely also saw reconnaissance activities as well, right? So this was mainly for two purposes, and the second we can only assume, right? The first was to what workstation they should move, so they should deploy their backdoors. And the second one was probably involving scouting for defensive mechanisms, right? Including our own agent.
So what are your recommendations here? I mean, for organizations who think they may be of interest to this group, what are the best practices here to keep them out?
So I will start relating back to the general suspected initial intrusion vectors and JAGS and probably wrap it up. So at this point, when we are still trying to determine the exact initial intrusion vectors, I would say protection measures against the usual suspects come to mind. This also relates to what we usually observe if we take and survey the whole threat landscape targeting telcos. So this is mostly phishing and social engineering awareness, of course, including proper examination of emails that originate from untrusted sources, vulnerability management, of course, especially on internet exposed services or devices, deployment of modern detection systems. So JAGS also mentioned these characteristic of the Sandman cluster, where they were hopping on workstations where our system was not present on, and deployment of this system, especially on mission critical endpoints or endpoints that store sensitive data.
There's recommendations that we can and should give for the telco space and sort of the gov space in particular, as Alex mentioned. But I'd also like to point out that part of the pain and difficulty of seeing threat actors be successful on telcos is that the implication here is that these are enabler operations. They are meant to enable further collection downstream to other customers, to folks, using phones, using internet, being provided by these different, telco providers. And the difficulty there is, we can talk about how a telco could defend itself better. But we also have this general concern that comes with the fact that any aspect of security or privacy that is contingent on the good defense of a telco is in many ways sort of defeated categorically by the lack of defense within some of these organizations, or, just by falling prey in some ways, as happens to everybody. In particular, what I have in mind is, we're talking about super advanced, very capable threat actors going into telcos and doing special things. But I think we're also living at a time where you have actors like Lapsus or Starfraud or the Com in general, where I don't think anybody would put them at a high level of sophistication, but they're also proving just how porous the telco space can be. So when you're talking about giving recommendations for folks in general, I mean, the one thing that we need to desperately run away from is two-factor via SMS. Anything that has to do with account verification that requires entirely on a phone number is something that we just have to abandon categorically at this point and move to more robust solutions. And then we can have more interesting conversations about what's happening with espionage enabler ops at telcos.
Our thanks to Aleksandar Milenkoski and Juan Andres Guerrosade from SentinelOne's SentinelLabs for joining us. The research is titled Sandman APT, a mystery group targeting telcos with a LuaJIT Toolkit. We'll have a link in the show notes. What's the true cost of a single cybersecurity incident? Try $4.3 million, and it's even higher in the United States. Each organization faces more than 1,200 cyber attacks per year. Tally that up, and you're staring down some hefty losses. Getting ahead of these threats requires the right technology for tying cyber risk to business impact, so you can add context to any risk decision, prioritize remediation, and report what matters most to your key stakeholders. LuaJIT's Risk Cloud Cyber Risk and Controls Compliance solution makes all of that possible. Learn more at LuaJITgate.com. The CyberWire Research Saturday podcast is a production of N2K Networks, proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. This episode was produced by Liz Irvin and senior producer Jennifer Iben. Our mixer is Elliot Peltzman. Our executive editor is Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.